The dust of the platform tasted like failure. Elias felt it coat his tongue, a grit of endings before anything had begun. He stood with his shoulders held in a way he hoped looked steady, but his hands, clutching the handle of his simple wooden box, trembled just enough to betray him. The sun was a hammer overhead, beating the color from the sky, from the raw-planked buildings of the town, from the faces staring at him. She was there, the woman from the photograph, Clara. Her face in the picture had been soft, a sepia promise. In person, it was sharp, pinched with a disappointment so profound it was like a physical blow. Beside her stood her father, a man built of lard and certainty, his thumbs hooked in a vest that strained at the buttons. This was Silas Croft. He circled Elias once, a rancher inspecting livestock he had no intention of buying. This is him. Croft's voice was thick, used to filling rooms and silencing arguments. He did not speak to Elias, but to his daughter, as if Elias were a parcel delivered to the wrong address. Clara just nodded, her gaze fixed on the worn cuffs of Elias's coat, the scuff on his boots, the plain, unadorned wood of the box he carried as if it held the last of his hope. It did. "He's thin as a fence rail," Croft declared to the gathering crowd of onlookers, who had materialized from the general store and the saloon, drawn by the scent of judgment. "And his clothes. He looks like he wrestled a scarecrow and lost." A low chuckle moved through the small crowd. Elias kept his eyes on the horizon, on the wavering line where the pale sky met the endless, unforgiving land. He would not give them his gaze. "The advertisement promised a man of means," Croft continued, his voice rising with theatrical indignation. "A man to help build a life. This is a charity case. He'd be a drain, not a boon. We have no use for a pauper." The word hung in the dry air, heavy and sharp. Pauper. It settled on Elias's shoulders, a shroud woven from their scorn. Clara finally looked at his face, her own expression a miserable mix of embarrassment and relief. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. The deal was broken. The promise was dust. Silas Croft made a show of it, a grand gesture of dismissal with a fleshy hand. "Go on back where you came from. We'll not have you. The Crofts don't take in strays." They turned and walked away, Clara's shoulders hunched, her father's back ramrod straight with self-importance. The crowd, its entertainment concluded, began to melt away, leaving behind murmurs that clung to Elias like wet paper. He was left alone on the platform, the wooden box suddenly 100-pound weight, the sun a merciless eye. He did not move. There was nowhere to go, forward or back. He just stood in the silence they had left him, a man unmade. Lena watched it all from the deep shade of the mercantile's porch. She had seen the train arrive, had seen the man step off, looking like a sapling in a field of stone. She saw the girl, pretty in a brittle sort of way, and the father, a man whose shadow was bigger than his soul. Lena knew Silas Croft. Everyone did. He was a man who built his own stature by tearing down others. She had felt the town's collective sneer, a familiar pressure against her own skin. She'd worn that judgment for 5 years, ever since Jacob died and she'd chosen the land over the town, silence over pity. They called her the widow, a name that was both a fact and a condemnation. She watched the man, Elias, stand unmoving after the Crofts departed. He didn't slump. He didn't rage. He just stood there, rooted to his spot of public shame, a still point in the swirling dust. There was a stillness in him that she recognized. It was the quiet of a deep, banked fire, not the emptiness of a hollow shell. She saw the knuckles on the hand holding his box were white, the only sign of the storm inside him. She finished her transaction, the sack of flour and slab of salt pork feeling heavier than usual. She loaded them onto her wagon, the movements practiced and economical. Her horse, a gray gelding named Dust, flicked his ears. The street was nearly empty now. The man was still there, a piece of driftwood left by a cruel tide. Lena didn't think it through as a decision. It was more like a stone shifting inside her, settling into a new place. An impulse born of tired fury and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Kinship. She tied Dust's reins to the hitching post and walked across the street. Her boots made no sound in the thick dust. He didn't seem to notice her until she was standing a few feet away. He finally lowered his eyes from the horizon to look at her. They were gray, the color of a winter sky, and held whole winters in them. She didn't offer comfort. Words of pity were cheap coins, and he had just been proven worthless in the town's currency. She spoke as she would to a fence post she was about to fix. "I have work," she said. Her voice was low, a little rough from disuse. "Need a hand on my place." He stared at her, his expression unreadable. He was processing the offer, weighing it against the humiliation. He looked from her weathered face to the calloused, capable hands at her sides. He looked at her wagon, loaded for a long ride away from this place. "It's hard work," she added, a warning. "And the pay is a roof and 3 meals. Nothing more." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Just one. A world of acceptance, of desperation, of a last, flickering chance, was held in that single motion. "Get your box," she said, and turned back toward her wagon without waiting to see if he followed. She heard his footsteps behind her, steady in the dust, a new sound in her solitary world. The journey was made in a silence as wide and empty as the plains around them. The creak of the wagon wheels and the soft plod of the horse were the only sounds that stitched the minutes together. The sun slid down the western sky, throwing long, distorted shadows that chased them. Dust lifted behind them like ghosts of the people they had been that morning. Lena kept her eyes on the path, a faint double track that was more memory than road. She did not look at the man beside her. She could feel his presence, though, a dense knot of quiet in the passenger seat. He held his wooden box on his lap, his hands resting on it, protective. He did not fidget. He simply endured the ride, watching the landscape unfurl. She offered him the canteen once. He took it, drank sparingly, and handed it back, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. The touch was like a spark in the cold, a reminder of a life that involved more than just her own skin. An hour passed, then 2. The land grew stonier, the grass thinner. This was her country, a place that discouraged visitors. It was a landscape that demanded resilience and offered little in return but space. So much space. They crested a low rise, and her homestead came into view. It wasn't much. A small, sturdy house of sod and timber, hunkered down against the wind. A barn that listed slightly to the north. A web of fences that looked like they were holding the land together with raw thread. And off to the side, under a lone, twisted cottonwood, was a single mound of earth marked with a plain wooden cross. "Jacob." She saw the man's eyes flicker to the grave, linger there for a moment, and then move away. He understood. He didn't need to ask. She pulled the wagon to a halt near the barn. The air was cooler here, the silence deeper. It was a waiting silence, not an empty one. For the first time, she felt a prickle of uncertainty. Bringing him here, it had changed the shape of the silence already. "The barn," she said, gesturing with her chin. "There's hay in the loft. It's dry." He nodded, sliding off the wagon seat. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of someone conserving every ounce of energy. He took his box and walked toward the barn without a backward glance. Lena unhitched Dust and led him to the trough. While the horse drank, she went inside the house. It was one room, clean but stark. A fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner. The air smelled of wood smoke and solitude. She ladled a thick portion of yesterday's stew into a bowl. It was mostly potatoes and a little salt pork, but it was hot. She carried the bowl out to the barn. The last of the sun's light came through the wide-open doors, filling the space with a dusty, golden haze. He had set his box down carefully in a corner and was standing in the middle of the floor, just looking. He was taking the measure of the place. She held out the bowl. He took it, his gaze meeting hers for a second time. There was a question in his eyes, but he didn't ask it. "Eat," she said. It was all the contract they needed. She turned and walked back to the house, leaving him to the barn and the encroaching shadows. She did not lock her door. She never had. But tonight, the fact of it felt like a statement. A fragile offering of trust in a world that had offered him none. The days found a rhythm. It was a rhythm not of words, but of work. The sun would crack the horizon, and when Lena emerged from her house, Elias would already be up, splitting wood or checking the fences. She would leave a plate of bread and jerky on the porch railing for him, and he would take it when she had gone to the well. They were two planets in a careful orbit, held in place by the gravity of shared tasks. He was a tireless worker. The woodpile grew into a fortress against the coming winter. A section of fence that had sagged for a year was now taut and straight. He moved rocks from her small vegetable patch, his back a long, straight line of effort. He never complained. He never spoke unless spoken to, and she rarely spoke. But she watched him. She saw the way his hands, though calloused, were deft and clever. He fixed the handle on her axe, sanding the new wood until it was smooth as polished stone. He rethatched a section of the barn roof that had been leaking for 2 seasons, his movements patient and precise. He asked for nothing, but slowly, he began to mend the broken edges of her world. One evening, a cold wind came down from the north, carrying the first real bite of autumn. It was a wind that turned mean, that sought out the cracks in walls and soles. Lena sat by her fire, wrapped in a blanket, and thought of the barn. She thought of the hayloft and the wind that would be slicing through the gaps in the timber. She got up, took the heavy wool blanket from Jacob's side of the bed, the side she never used, and walked out into the blustering dark. The barn door was shut against the wind. She pushed it open a crack. A small lantern cast a low, flickering light inside. He was sitting on a hay bale, his back to her, running a piece of cloth over one of the tools from his box. He was so absorbed in the task he didn't hear her. She laid the folded blanket on a crate just inside the door, where he would see it. She didn't say a word. She just pulled the door shut and walked back to the warmth of her house. The next morning, when she came out, the blanket was gone. Later, she saw it folded neatly at the foot of his hay bale bed in the loft. A week later, she found a small, perfectly carved wooden bird sitting on the porch railing next to her morning plate. It was no bigger than her thumb, but the detail was astonishing. The feathers were etched with a delicate hand, the head cocked as if listening. It was made from a scrap of pine, but he had found the soul of a bird within it. She picked it up. The wood was warm, smooth, felt alive. She took it inside and set it on the mantelpiece, the first and only object of beauty in the stark room. It watched her from its perch, a silent testament. The unspoken kindnesses began to flow both ways. He started leaving a bucket of fresh well water on her porch every morning, saving her the first trip of the day. She started making extra stew, a thicker, richer stew with more meat, and leaving the pot on the hearth for him to help himself when he came in from the cold. They were stitching their lives together with these small, raw threads of care. One afternoon, she was weeding the small plot by the cottonwood tree. She didn't tend Jacob's grave, not in the way the town women tended theirs with flowers and tears. She just kept the weeds from choking it. It was a duty, a quiet act of remembering. She felt a presence and looked up. Elias was standing at the edge of the plot, his hat in his hands. He was looking at the simple wooden cross. "You miss him," he said. His voice was quiet, a statement, not a question. It was the first personal thing he had ever said to her. Lena's hands stilled in the dirt. She looked at the mound of earth, at the name she had carved into the wood herself. "Every day," she replied, her own voice thin. He nodded, his eyes full of a deep, sorrowful understanding. He did not offer condolences. He just stood there for a moment, sharing the space of her grief, making it a little less lonely. Then he put his hat back on and walked away, back to the fence he was mending. But the air between them had changed. A wall had crumbled, silently, into dust. A few nights later, she was jolted awake by a sound from the barn, a choked cry. She sat up, her heart pounding in the darkness. She waited, listening. The wind moaned around the corners of the house. Then she heard it again, a muffled shout of pure terror. She didn't think. She pulled on her boots and a coat over her nightdress and ran to the barn, her lantern swinging wildly, casting dancing, monstrous shadows. She pushed the door open. Elias was in the loft, tangled in his blankets, thrashing against some unseen enemy. "No," he was gasping. Don't lock it." "Elias," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through his nightmare. She held the lantern up high. He bolted upright, his eyes wide with a fear so raw it made her own breath catch. He was drenched in sweat, his chest heaving. He stared at her, at the open barn door, at the wide, dark world outside, and the terror slowly receded from his face, replaced by a deep, shuddering exhaustion. She stood at the bottom of the ladder, the lantern held steady now. "The door is open," she said, her voice softer. "I don't lock doors." He just stared at her, his breathing slowing. He finally nodded, a gesture of profound, fragile gratitude. He was a man who knew what it was to be locked in, to be trapped. She understood, then, that the shame of the train station was only the most recent cage he had been put in. She retreated, pulling the barn door mostly shut but leaving a gap, a sliver of dark freedom. Back in her house, she stoked the fire until it blazed, fighting back the cold that had little to do with the temperature. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash, her father used to say. She looked at the little wooden bird on her mantel, its tiny form solid in the flickering light. Something new was being carved, she realized, right here in the heart of her solitude. The first sign of trouble was the dust, a plume of it on the far horizon, too deliberate for the wind, too slow for a passing storm. Lena saw it from the well, the bucket halfway up. Her hand froze on the handle. Her stomach tightened into a cold knot. Riders. No one ever came out this far. Not unless they were bringing trouble. She finished hauling the bucket up, her movements stiff. She scanned the planes again. 3 of them. They were moving at a steady, unhurried pace, the pace of men who are sure of their destination and their right to be there. Elias had seen them too. He was standing by the half-mended wagon wheel, a tool hanging forgotten from his hand. He watched the approaching dust with that same stillness she'd seen at the train station, but this time it was not resignation. It was the stillness of a predator. She walked over to him, her own fear a hard stone in her chest. She had built this quiet world out of the wreckage of her old one. She would not let them shatter it. "Go inside the barn," she told him, her voice low and even. "Stay out of sight." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes searching her face. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it was absolute. It was the first time he had ever refused her. "This is coming for me. I'll not hide from it behind you." A fierce, unexpected pride surged through her. He would not hide. He would stand. So would she. She nodded once, accepting it. She went into the house, but she didn't go to hide. She came back out with Jacob's old shotgun. It was heavy in her hands, familiar and terrible. She didn't load it. His presence was enough. For now. They stood together in front of the house, a silent, unmoving pair. The wind picked up, pulling at her hair, whispering ugly things. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. The riders were close enough now to be seen clearly. The man in the lead was Silas Croft. His face was puffy and red, his expression a mask of righteous fury. The 2 men behind him were town loafers, men who would follow any bully who promised a little power or a free drink. Croft pulled his horse to a halt a dozen yards from them, his cronies fanning out on either side. He sneered, his gaze sweeping over the homestead with contempt before landing on Elias. "I heard you'd taken up with the widow," Croft boomed, his voice oozing disdain. "Living off her charity. I knew you were a pauper, but I didn't figure you for a parasite too." Elias didn't flinch. He just watched Croft, his face a calm, unreadable mask. "This is my land, Silas," Lena said, her voice carrying clearly in the tense quiet. The shotgun rested in the crook of her arm. "You're not welcome here. State your business and leave." Croft's eyes shifted to her, his lip curling. "My business is with him. This town has standards. We don't need vagrants and beggars squatting on decent folks' land, making a mockery of us. My daughter was humiliated by his very presence. He needs to go. He is my hired hand," Lena stated, each word a stone laid in a wall. "He works for his keep. It's no business of yours or the town's." "A hired hand?" Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Don't play me for a fool, woman. This is an offense. He's leaving this territory. One way or another." He shifted his weight in the saddle, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his belt. "Now, you can step aside, or you can find out how stubborn I can be." Lena didn't move. She felt Elias shift beside her, a subtle drawing in of energy. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them and the three men on horseback. The wind died down, and the silence was absolute. "That's far enough, Mr. Croft," Elias said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air with an authority that stunned everyone, including Lena. It was a voice that came from under floorboards, from a place of deep, settled strength. Croft, momentarily taken aback, recovered with a sneer. "You have no say here, boy. You are nothing. A man is measured by what he has, and you have nothing." "You're wrong," Elias said softly. He took a step forward, away from the protection of Lena and her shotgun. He walked to the spot where he had been mending the wagon and picked up his wooden box. He held it not like a shield, but like an offering. He walked back to the center of the yard and knelt in the dust. The two cronies exchanged confused glances. Croft watched with suspicion. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. What was he doing? With slow, deliberate movements, Elias unlatched the simple brass clasps on the box. He opened the lid. It wasn't gold. Not at first glance. The top layer was a collection of carving tools, worn smooth with use, their steel edges gleaming. Beneath them, nestled in soft, faded cloth, was a world in miniature. He began to take them out, one by one, and set them in the dust. A hawk, its wings spread for flight, every feather exquisitely rendered. A wolf, its head thrown back in a silent howl, its fur a ripple of texture. A sleeping fox, curled so tightly it was a perfect circle of peace. A mare nuzzling her foal. Each piece was a miracle of life captured in wood. So real they seemed to breathe in the still, tense air. He reached deeper into the box. Beneath a false bottom, his hand emerged with a small, heavy leather pouch. He untied the drawstring and poured its contents into his palm. Gold. Not coins, but raw, heavy nuggets, gleaming with a dull, rich light. The kind of gold a man pans from a secret creek over years of patient labor. He looked up at Silas Croft, his gray eyes clear and steady. "You measure a man by what he has," Elias said, his voice still quiet, but now it filled the entire world. "This is the work of my hands. This is the gold from my own labor. Tell me, Mr. Croft, what is it you have that you did not take or inherit?" Silence. The two cronies stared, mesmerized, at the carvings in the dust, their brutish intent completely forgotten. Croft's face, which had been red with rage, slowly turned a mottled, sickly white. His argument, his entire justification, had been built on the idea of Elias's worthlessness. It had just been dismantled before his eyes, not with violence, but with undeniable truth. He was the one who looked poor now, his wealth of bluster and pride turning to ash. He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing to say. He had been measured and found wanting. Without another word, he yanked on his horse's reins, turning it so sharply the animal grunted in protest. He galloped away, his back stiff with humiliation. His two men, after a final, awestruck look at the wooden carvings, scrambled to follow, their retreat a cloud of ignominious dust. The dust settled. The sound of the hoofbeats faded into the vast silence of the plains. Lena and Elias were alone again, standing in the yard with the evidence of his true worth laid out between them. The wind returned, softer this time, a gentle sigh of relief. Lena lowered the shotgun, its weight suddenly immense. She looked from the scattered nuggets of gold to the family of wooden animals breathing silently in the sun. She looked at Elias, who was still kneeling, his gaze on the things he had created. She walked over and knelt beside him in the dust. She didn't look at the gold. Her eyes were on the carvings. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and gently touched the head of the sleeping fox. The wood was impossibly smooth, imbued with a life and warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. "You're an artist," she whispered. The words felt inadequate, small for the scale of the truth she was witnessing. He finally looked at her, and for the first time, the winters in his eyes had begun to thaw. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "My father was a clockmaker. He taught me to see the world in small pieces." "He taught you well," she said. He began to gather the carvings, placing them back in their cloth nests with infinite care. She helped him, her rough, calloused fingers brushing against his as they worked. They packed the box together, a shared, sacred task. When it was done, he stood and helped her to her feet. They stood there for a long moment, the silence between them no longer a space of caution, but one of deep, resonant understanding. That evening, he did not go to the barn. She had cleared the small spare room, a space that had been empty for 5 years, filled only with dust motes and memory. She had put the wool blanket on the cot. He brought his box inside the house and set it by the hearth. The house, which had been a shell of duty and grief, breathed again. It had a new heart. He spent the next day carving. By evening, a new bird sat on the mantelpiece. This one a tiny, fierce-looking wren, its head cocked defiantly. It sat beside the first bird. Pair. Family. She named him then, not with a document or a vow before a preacher, but in the quiet of her own heart as she looked at him across the supper table. He was not the hired hand. He was not the pauper or the vagrant. He was Elias, and she, for the first time since Jacob's death, was not the widow. She was Lena. Weeks turned into a season. The first snow fell, blanketing the plains in a clean, quiet white. The world outside grew harsh and cold, but inside the small house, a slow, steady warmth was growing. They talked more, not in long conversations, but in shared observations, in quiet questions and simple answers that held entire volumes of meaning. He taught her the feel of different woods. She taught him the names of the winter constellations. They were building a new life, not on a grand promise or a legal contract, but on a foundation of shared silence, mended fences, and small, perfect things carved from the heart of the wood. The final image of their beginning was not one of passion, but one of profound peace. They sat on the porch one frigid, star-drenched night, wrapped in blankets, watching the frost glitter on the fence posts. A cup of hot, weak tea warmed Lena's hands. Elias was sanding a small, half-formed shape, the rasp of the paper a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the immense quiet. He was carving a new piece, a man and a woman, standing side by side, looking out at the same horizon. The house was behind them, a single square of golden light against the vast, beautiful, and no longer empty dark. They had found their home, not in a place, but in each other. This story, it ain't just about a man with a secret or a woman on a lonely farm. It's about the truth of what makes a person rich or poor. It isn't the gold in their purse or the dirt on their hands. Real wealth, the kind that can't be spent or stolen, is the skill in your fingers, the honesty in your gaze, the quiet courage it takes to stand your ground when the world has called you worthless. It's about the gold you find in another person's soul when you're brave enough to look past the dust. We all get judged. We all get left on a platform sometimes, with nothing but a box of our own secret hopes. And maybe we think that's the end of the line, but this story says it isn't. It says that out there, in the quiet places, someone might just see the strength you hold inside, not the poverty the world wants to label you with. They might just offer you a roof, a meal, a reason to unpack that box. So here's your naming. You're not just what they call you. You are the thing you can create, the kindness you can offer, the stand you are willing to make. And if you're brave enough to see past the world's loud opinions, you might just find that the most valuable thing you'll ever own is the quiet trust of another broken, beautiful soul. You might just find you can build a home in the very heart of the wilderness.